Welcome back to another exciting episode on the Whammy podcast called Solving the People Puzzle, where I, your host, Francois de Wet, every week interview exciting experts from the HR field and just discuss topics that are relevant now for the HR community, for the audience, and for anybody that is curious and following our journey. So firstly, like I always do, welcome, Dieter. It is fantastic to have you on the podcast. I appreciate your time so much.
Thanks so much, Francois, and really looking forward to our conversation. It's a privilege to be with you and your guests.
Incredible. So for those of you who don't know, today is an extremely special episode because Dieter really is a phenomenal expert in the HR industry. Dieter, I'm not even going to try and come up with your entire CV, but CHRO, HR Exec of the Year, you've been a Group Chief People Officer, you've been a Managing Consultant, you've been a scientist, a researcher. It's just been an incredible journey the last 15 years to have been following your career. Maybe if you would like to just sum up where you are now and what you're doing currently now, because you are not in South Africa anymore.
That's correct, Francois. So I'm currently based in the Netherlands. So I joined the Academy to Innovate HR about 18 months ago in the role of a Chief HR Scientist, which basically means I'm responsible for a lot of our own regional research, our thought leadership, as well as then also engaging with our client base. We're in about 140 countries at the moment, so I really have the opportunity to engage with various HR professionals doing very interesting things around the world of work. So that's something that really motivates me. So that's kind of what I'm up to at the moment.
Amazing. We had a Whammy event last week. And so part of the podcast and everything else we do around our product is to bring value to the HR community. Because and it slots so perfectly into the academy that you're working now for. How do we innovate HR and take the fraternity forward? And I was mentioning to the audience, we were speaking about trends last week, and I can share in the show notes audience a link to that slide deck. And then someone made the comment. They said at the end of the presentation, they wondered to what extent the trends globally in HR are relevant to the trends in South Africa, and that just really sparked an idea on my side. And you now having access to 100 odd countries. Just a quick comment before we get into the topic around, are they relevant and is it the same?
It's a very good question, Francois, and I think it helps to think about it in terms of two categories. There will always be mega trends that will influence everybody in a similar way and in a similar fashion, and I think it's good to think about that more from a global sense. And then there's a second component that will always be context specific, because context does matter whenever you do anything related to people and related to HR. But I do believe we sometimes neglect to think what is going to be the global impact of some of the things that we do see happening in the world, and how does that translate into our local environments. So, take something like diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Globally, very big topic at the moment. However, locally, it plays out very differently in terms of the context within which it matters. But we can learn from both those environments. So whenever I speak to HR professionals, I say, have a look at what's happening in the world, ask the question, what does that mean to me where I find myself, and then bring those two views together. South Africa is busy with some really innovative stuff in the space, which I think is extremely, extremely exciting. And I do believe that there is some great opportunity, for the world to learn from South Africa, but also from South Africa to learn from the rest of the world and to find that balance.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, it's about context, exactly to your point.
Sure.
And we can learn from what's happening globally. We can contextualize it back in South Africa. There is this overall, and maybe we can get into the topic now, but there is this overall idea that, we are behind. And when you and I had our first conversation, if you actually start diving into it, from a knowledge perspective, from a technology perspective, from an ideas perspective, from a, just being professional, I think the audience would be surprised around that assumption that we are that far behind.
Yeah, I think it's a perception that we sometimes hold, and I think it's based on, things that happened in the past, and I think it's based on some perceptions that, we haven't necessarily created for ourselves, but the way that other people have seen us in the past. In my personal view, I think, as I've mentioned, South African professionals are busy with very innovative things. I think something that makes us really strong is the fact that sometimes we have to find very unconventional solutions to solve the problems with the resources that we have. I do believe in other parts of the world, and that's maybe something for us to think about in the South African context, is around how do we invest more in, the people side of things, into some of the newer tools, some of the newer methods. But the thinking for me personally is definitely there. And I think there is some really innovative stuff, that we are bringing to the table as, South Africans working in the HR and the people space. So I don't think we need to stand back at all. in terms of where we are and what we do and the type of work that we get involved in. I think we can be really proud to be, HR professionals within the South African context. Obviously, on the other side, economic instability, political instability, those things do play a bit of a role around where you spend your time and where your focus is going to be and the amount of resources that you have. But that does not, for me, detract from the value that we add to organizations. So, I try to encourage people I speak to, because sometimes there is a little bit of that view to say, I'm only from the South African context. I think we should let go of that, because I think we do really great stuff and great work that we can be very proud of.
Absolutely. Now, one of the pictures that you sent me last week was from the Fast Company that published an article, Why We Hate HR, a couple of years ago. And then they recently published an article, Why More People Want to Work in HR Now. And so for the audience, that is going to be the conversation today, the transition of the perception, the skills required, how HR is shifting and moving from Dieter's perspective, being in a research role, doing a lot of keynotes, doing a lot of writing and being part of panel conversations and conferences. So let's maybe go there, because it ties into this idea, Dieter, and the perception that, people hate HR, their reputation isn't great. We hear these one-liners. And I love the article you wrote the other day where there are these HR buzzwords and they seem new, but they're not really. But the one buzzword is, HR has they don't have a seat around the table or they don't have a voice. So let's start there and just unpack that maybe in various layers. In your opinion, where does that come from?
So I think there's a couple of things, Francois, to bear in mind there. I think that there is a historic, kind of context to that kind of leads us towards the conversation at the moment. I do believe we haven't necessarily done ourselves a lot of favors. When I speak to a lot of people and I say, and I wrote something the other day where I said, when I tell people, what do you do? Very few people say I work in HR, because immediately you get the response, oh, I'm going to send you my CV, or I've got this problem at work, or, oh, I had this terrible recruitment experience. So I think that everybody's association with HR isn't necessarily doing us any favors. And I sometimes joke and I say we need some people relations work, some public relations work that needs to happen around how we manage our reputation and how we manage our perception. So, Francois, I think that's a really good question, and I think there's a couple of things that we can unpack with regards to that. So you've mentioned, the seat around the table. I spoke to a CHRO the other day, and she mentioned something in jest, which I thought was quite telling of the time that we find ourselves in. And it's, she said before the pandemic, a lot of people were talking about HR seat at the table. Are we authorizing ourselves? After the pandemic, she realized she doesn't want to be in all the seats around all the tables where she could possibly be. And it showcased to us that the conversation around HR has shifted, right? It showcased to us that there's some new perceptions coming into the fold around what is the real value that HR or the people function or whatever you would like to call the function is going to add, in this new era and in this new era of work. I think what is so interesting at the moment is we are shifting to something that I like to label the human experience era, where I think as we head towards, things like Industry 5.0, there is this notion around what is the human being and technology and sustainability? What is that going to look like? And a lot of those challenges that world leaders are speaking about at the moment, if you look at things like the World Economic Forum and some other public domains, is actually human-rooted challenges that they are trying to solve, for the future. So I think there's some great things for us to think about in the horizon. And for me, it is a step change and a pivotal moment around what is HR going to be in this next chapter that we're going to write leading up to Industry 5.0. Just for context, that's whatever comes after the fourth industrial revolution. And a lot of people are starting to talk into that direction. And I think that's shifting the conversation quite a bit, in terms of what do we do in HR. And I think HR has always responded to the environment. If you look at our background and our past. Second industrial revolution, labor became a lot more organized. We stepped up in the capacity to say, let's start thinking about human welfare. Let's start thinking about, what does fair and equitable labor look like? When we kind of got to the 60s, 70s, again, a change post the wars around what does the civil movement look like, personnel management, strategic HR management, when we started saying, but hang on, there's a strategic angle we need to follow. And I really think we're at one of those moments again where we will see a great shift over the next couple of years. But it is up to us to go and shape what that narrative is going to look like. Because in the past, other people have shaped our narrative as HR professionals. And I don't necessarily think that that's the way that we should go going forward.
Yeah. Now, I completely agree with you. And I want to make a comment around that, because the point of the podcast is to create practical tools and tips and techniques for the audience to actually, embed or start thinking at least about starting today, starting tomorrow. So before we go to the shift conversation, what are some of those characteristics or elements that got imposed on us from a reputation or from a description perspective, from a labeling perspective? And the reason I'm asking this question is I want you as an audience member to take the following answer from Dieter and go and understand and think and maybe look in the mirror a bit around, does that describe me currently? Does that describe my environment currently? Because, behavioral change only starts or comes about through awareness. And I think, to your point, by us receiving the message, the label, the definition, that starts speaking into the identity. And let's just create some awareness there briefly for the audience to start understanding, am I still looking like that or doing that?
Francois, you mentioned such a key word in this conversation, and it's identity, right? What is the identity of who I am as a professional person and as an HR professional or practitioner? And there's a couple of questions we should always ask ourselves. The first one is, how do you show up in business and what do you perceive why you are there for what type of conversation? HR traditionally has been a little bit reactive, and there was nothing wrong with it at the time because that was what was called for. But yes, you have to ask yourself the question at the moment, are you responding or are you guiding and leading the conversation? Because responding has got its time and place, but where we are now, if you want to play a different role, you have to authorize yourself a bit more in that particular role. The second component is, what language do you use? Because HR professionals very often stumble over the fact, I sometimes tease people and say, it sounds like I've swallowed a textbook. That doesn't help business understand why I'm there. It doesn't help business understand what are those things that they can expect from me and I expect from them. And the third piece for me is around, how do you manage expectations? Because very often, going through a transition of what HR is bringing to the table, we have to help people understand that they also need to shift their mindset around what HR needs to bring and why HR is in the conversation. And for me, that comes through in practical things, right? If I did some research for a client recently where I pulled their last 3 years of executive agendas and minutes. And I did an analysis of that around how often does the people agenda pop up. And something that was quite interesting in that exercise was it's always last. It always doesn't get firm attention. And that sets a particular tone and a type of message. And those are some of the practical things, that we need to start changing as HR professionals. Now, you will only get taken seriously if firstly you understand the core part of the business that you want to contribute towards. So, the conversation around business acumen and strategic impact has been one, that we've had for a number of years. But it is about how do you make that real and practical in the day-to-day. Types of conversations you get yourself into, the types of projects that you drive, the language you use to connect to the business and to really speak towards that narrative. So I think it is some of those things. Obviously, all of this can only be backed up if we do the basics right. Nobody wants to talk to you about strategic workforce planning and talent management and OD if, the basic recruitment piece is not in place or the basic compliance stuff is not in place. But we are at a pivotal point where, through some new developments in technology, where I firmly believe that we can put those elements in place to spend our time elsewhere and to ask the question, where should I be now to make the most meaningful impact? And that's the type of thing that we're going to have to start to manage.
Sure. So much to unpack there. I think if I can summarize how you show up, how you communicate, how you manage expectations, are the basics in place? Are you being reactive or are you being assertive? But then also, do you have the language? Do you have the acumen? Do you understand your business? Do you understand the impact? One thing that just came to mind while you were speaking is to what degree are we as HR community being enabled? And I'm going right back to the tertiary institution because a lot of the persona in HR doesn't necessarily match the requirements today. And there's a foundational element to that, and then also an ongoing continuous development part to this conversation.
Yeah, you're spot on. I think there is something that we first need to acknowledge, right? There's a lot of practitioners that just end up in HR, right? So it's not necessarily that a lot of people said, HR is what I want to do. Sure, we do find those people. But I sometimes also think people get into HR with a very big misconception of what it is that the function actually does. And I'll admit this in this conversation, whenever anybody tells me in an interview, oh no, I got into HR because I just love people, that's a red flag for me immediately because that's not why you're in HR. You're in HR because you want to understand how do I optimize the effectiveness of organizations and people in the workplace through their behavior. That's kind of why you get into HR. It's not because, I love the people agenda. So I think there's a couple of things. We have to start thinking about how do we help people choose to be in HR, and how do we change that perspective that people have around why they get into HR. Because sometimes in organizations, there's this perspective, oh, you're in HR because you couldn't do anything else. That's not the case. You find highly educated, very capable and very competent people, but for some reason we are not drawing all of those people to the HR profession. The Society for Human Resource Management a couple of years ago, I think in the early 2010, 2011s, had this project that they ran to say, how do we make the profession attractive? I'm not as sophisticated as they are, so I kind of just use the terminology, how do you make HR sexy for people, that people say,
Yes.
That's what I want to be when I grow up.
Yes.
That's the one side. The other side is how do we develop that type of practitioner? Because we have been developing people with too narrow a scope. We've been focusing very much on, and it's important, the labor side of things, the law side of things, where things came from. We have to open that up a lot more to include elements of digital. We have to open up a lot more there to include things like, what are the mega trends that's happening in the world that's influencing our relationship with work? Because that's the type of conversations that HR needs to be involved in. So, I think there is some work to be done at tertiary level, but also once HR gets into organizations, it's almost as if a lot of HR professionals look after the rest of the organization so much in terms of their development and continuous growth that they forget that they also have to grow. And that's a real challenge, right? There's an article that came out a couple of weeks ago with the headline that says, where has all the CHROs gone? Because there was this notion that the good people that grew during the pandemic in terms of leadership roles, they've now shifted into other executive roles, COO type of roles. And they've kind of grown out of the HR profession, which is positive on the one side, because we are starting then to see people move into these leadership roles and CEO roles. On the other side, it flags to us, what does that next level of the pipeline look like? Because it's not necessarily that forthcoming. Last year was the first year, and I don't know how many years, where more people appointed CHROs from external to their own organization as opposed to growing them themselves. And that's a red flag for us for future. So
that's not great. No, that's not great.
I think that's some of the things to think about, yeah.
No, I think spot on. And you started touching on, so two comments from my side. Firstly, obviously the technology, the boom, the AI, the machine learning, the chat GPT, all of these elements coming to the fore. We can't ignore that anymore. I think, when we do presentations, and last week again, people will often go to, okay, what about AI? Specifically now with WAMI. And then I always go, okay, what would you like it to do? And then they can't answer me. Or where would you like to see the impact of it? And then there really isn't good thinking behind it. And so, however, there are good use cases where the technology can automate some of the basic administrative and operational tasks that a lot of the HR departments are stuck in for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. So I think there's something there to consider. But then also a second piece to this is the rest of the business also needs to recognize and enable HR. Yeah. I do speak with a lot of clients and colleagues where they do have the intent that we are speaking about now, but the environment is not conducive for being earlier in the agenda, to have more assertiveness, to hear their voice. And I think that can be quite discouraging for these HR professionals who are trying to make a difference and step it up.
Yeah, agree. I mean, I think there's a couple of things to consider there. The first one is I always trust the intent, right? So I trust the intent that HR professionals are there because they want to make a difference and want to make an impact. Having said that, then there has to be certain elements that enables that. I think you're right. I think with technology, we've been talking about the strategic business partner and shared services since the early 90s. What has finally started to happen is that I think the technology is almost caught up with what we've wanted it to do, because you're spot on. That conversation around utilize technology to become more strategic, and then all you do is you automate the process. That's not making you more strategic, that's making you more efficient. And I think at the moment that's starting to shift a little bit, where we say, how through things like AI can we increase the coverage and the reach of HR solutions? Most employees, if you start thinking from the outside in, if you think about their life, their engagement and interaction with HR is very limited. And their engagement and interaction with, some of those key moments that matter to them is actually not that well defined. And I think through technology, we have this opportunity. I was in an organization where we did an analysis, and, we realized that 90% of our employees were sales employees. They were not based at our main campus environment. So their interactions with any type of HR was limited to I'm appointing somebody in my team, as well as then I'm going into the office and I want to log my leave. That was literally their engagement and their interaction. And what I'm excited about with things like AI is how can we extend that reach through intelligent technologies? And how can we then ensure that almost HR becomes this, I don't want to call it, HR in your pocket, but it becomes this thing that I have access to all of the time, because that's what HR needs to be. It's not in the ivory tower somewhere. It has to be in the flow of work. It has to be in the day-to-day type of things that we do. So I'm quite excited about these things, but yes, you are right. We are going to have to go through quite a few conversations on, but what do we want the technology to augment? Because just because the technology can do certain elements does not necessarily mean those are the ones that's going to add the most value. So we have to ask those questions, on the one side, where does it fit? And then on the other side, how do we apply it ethically, and how do we apply it in a way that is sustainable for the longer term? The conversation, around, I know Goldman Sachs spoke about 300 million jobs will be replaced by AI. I'm not really convinced that that's going to be the case. And think about HR professionals. I think your job will most definitely look different, given the fact that some activities and tasks can fall away, but I don't think the job is no longer going to be there. It's just going to have to start shaping in a bit of a different way. And it's a different conversation, those two, because the one is about extinction and the other one is about evolution. And I think we just need to make sure we focus on the right stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think if you just zoom out for a second and you refer to industrial revolutions, and we're nearing the fifth one, personalization, they're starting to call it, jobs have always changed. The way we work has always changed. It would be ignorant for us to stop at the third or the fourth industrial revolution and go, okay, this is it, we've arrived. It's computers and an office, and this is it. Thank goodness we're not in a factory anymore, or in agri in the fields, and we can only work when the sun comes up. But the point is, it has always evolved and changed. And what it requires from us is to evolve with it. And I think that's where the fifth industrial revolution is starting to allude to this concept of personalization, innovation, purpose, inclusivity, this deep multi-level cooperation between people and machines, which requires from us a higher level of consciousness. I mentioned awareness earlier in the conversation, intuition, empathy, some of these deep interpersonal skills that are required because of what the AI is doing in terms of efficiency that you mentioned earlier, because there is a big difference between digitization and digitalization, and we often believe or think that by replacing an admin task with a computer or machine or a program, now we're into big data, which is not really the same thing.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I think the next industrial revolution for me is a lot more about how do we rehumanize work and our relationship with work.
Yes.
Because you're absolutely right. You want to have a meaningful job, and we're also starting to realize that we have to start acknowledging the human being in context, because work means something different to anybody else. For some people, it's vocation. It's what I wake up for in the morning. For other people, it's a way to earn a living so that I can get to other things that's important to me. So that human being in context, I think, is what this next conversation is going to be about, as well as then the fact that, that there are some real bigger macro challenges that we do need to solve for. I know I'm opening up a can of worms here, but, things like climate change, shifts in economic power, consumerism that's going to change. Those are real topics that as a global community, we need to start thinking about, and that is going to filter into, the way that we work. There's this beautiful example where somebody says, why sometimes in my organization, when I engage, with other practitioners or with HR particularly, it feels like 1960. And the moment I become a consumer outside, it feels like 2020. Those are the types of things that we're going to have to consider, because it's real human beings that want to do meaningful work, and also has different expectations on what they want, when they want it, how they want it, which is that whole personalization component that you spoke about. So it's a good thing. We need to be open for it. Is it going to be different? Yes. It's going to be scary, most definitely, but I think it's definitely going to be worth it if we engage proactively with that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where we're seeing this the most is the Gen Zs, the Gen Alphas. That's just, and I mean, let's not open that can of worms again. But we have to recognize the fact that more than ever, people often go and they say that this generation is not connected. But actually, if you start going into the research and you start realizing what is meaningful to them as a generation, It's quite a different. Okay, Dieter, let's start wrapping this up. I think let's leave the audience with, all right, given what we've said, let's come back to the picture you sent me, why we hate HR now, why everybody wants to work in HR. What are the skills required for us to effectively transition amidst everything that's going on? In your opinion, just a couple.
So we talk about 5 core skills at the Academy that we believe, is that gateway for the HR professional towards the future. And the first one I've mentioned, is around business acumen. For us particularly, how do I make sense of the complexity of the operating environment, and how can I understand what that means for me, my customer, my business? So I think that's a critical skill, to be able to learn. I do want to stress the fact that business acumen is not only about being able to understand a financial statement, which is usually the example we use. It goes a lot broader than that and goes a lot deeper than that. So for me, that's the first one. Second one is data literacy. You need to understand, how do I create data, work with data, read data, and very much I think there, how do I understand data and can convey the story that data tells to inform business decision making. So there's this data literacy piece that I think is quite important. Digital agility. Digital agility on the one side, is about how do I leverage technology to do my work. But on the other side, it's a lot more about openness to new experiences, about adopting that mindset to see new solutions, being able to try certain things. And I almost, if I can put it in simple language, say, don't try to be perfect, just try to create a movement. That's kind of that type of thinking that sits in digital agility. People advocacy remains important, the stuff that Dave Ulrich has been speaking about for decades. I think where the shift is going to become, you have to learn as an HR professional, how am I going to build cultures of well-being? How am I going to create inclusive organizations? How am I going to help organizations navigate change? And how do I help and develop a leadership cadre in future that is able to deal with the ethical challenges that we will face, so those moral principles and dilemmas. And then the last one we talk about is called, how do you deliver impact? And we break that down a little bit into some of the more behavioral components that you've also mentioned, right? So how do you think about problem solving? How do I think about making sense of what's happening in the world around me and finding an actionable way forward? How do I engage with people and manage conflict? How do I communicate with impact and with meaning? So you can kind of see what I've mentioned here. The core things that we believe is going to be important is actually not necessarily only your technical skill that you have. That's your ticket to the game. So yes, do I need to understand the basics of HR? Most definitely. Do you need to specialize in a couple of domains? You need some in-depth knowledge there. But these are the 5 elements that we believe, regardless of rank, role, or title, is going to be important for you as an HR professional. And those are some of the conversations that we want to have with, with the community on how do we build those in future.
Now, I can promise you, if we were able to reverse that into a story or a slide deck or a video, and we go and show that to young individuals not sure what to go and study, that is a compelling argument why HR is sexy and why people should be drawn to this. So thank you so much for that. Dieter, it's been an absolute pleasure. I wish we could do this for the whole day, but thank you for being on the show. There's so many things to unpack, so much to think about. I would love for you to just end off, maybe share something where can the audience get a hold of you, read up on you, interact with you, engage with you, find out more about what you're up to.
No, thanks so much, Francois. And I really appreciate the conversation about where HR is going. It is something that you would have picked up that I am very passionate about. Audience can find me on LinkedIn. That's the best place. So you can either contact me there. I also do share a lot of the work that we do at the Academy via LinkedIn as the easiest avenue just for people to get some access to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode on Solving the People Puzzle. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Have a nice day.